The courtroom fell into a silence so profound that even breathing seemed like an act of defiance when Bradley Hutchinson III walked through those heavy oak doors wearing a smirk that had never known consequence. If this story resonates with you, hit that like button right now, because what happens next will restore your faith in justice. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Judge Elias Monroe's courtroom, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches that had witnessed decades of truth and lies. The air itself felt heavy, thick with anticipation, as if the walls knew something extraordinary was about to unfold. The gallery was packed, standing room only, because word had spread fast about this case. Bradley Hutchinson III, son of Governor Marcus Hutchinson, was finally facing charges, and everyone wanted to witness whether privilege would once again triumph over justice. Bradley entered the courtroom like he owned it, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor with an arrogant rhythm. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people in that room, made in 6 months, and his perfectly styled blonde hair caught the light as he turned to wave at someone in the gallery, actually waved as if he were at a social function rather than facing serious criminal charges. His lawyer, Gerald Pemberton, walked beside him with the resigned expression of a man who knew his client was his own worst enemy. Judge Monroe sat behind the bench, his silver hair neatly combed, his face carved from years of weighing truth against deception. At 63, he had the kind of presence that didn't require volume or theatrics. When Elias Monroe looked at you, you felt the weight of every decision he'd ever made, every life he'd touched, every principle he'd refused to compromise. His dark eyes missed nothing, and right now they were fixed on Bradley Hutchinson III with the steady, unblinking focus of a hawk studying its prey. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Elias Monroe presiding. Court is now in session." The room stood as one, the shuffling of feet and rustling of clothing creating a brief symphony of compliance before settling back into that electric silence. Judge Monroe gestured with one hand, a small, economical movement that somehow commanded absolute authority. "Please be seated." His voice was deep, measured, carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "We are here today in the matter of the state versus Bradley James Hutchinson III. The defendant is charged with vehicular assault, leaving the scene of an accident, reckless endangerment, driving under the influence and obstruction of justice. He paused, letting the severity of the charges settle over the courtroom like a cold rain. These are not minor infractions. A man nearly lost his life because of the events we are here to examine. The prosecutor, District Attorney Sarah Chen, rose from her table. She was a woman in her early 40s, sharp as a razor, with black hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched the severity of her expression. She'd built her career on cases that others considered unwinnable, and she had a particular distaste for defendants who believed their family name was a shield against accountability. "Your Honor, the state is ready to proceed," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. Bradley's lawyer stood as well. Gerald Pemberton was in his late 50s, a veteran defense attorney who had made a fortune defending the indefensible. He had silver hair, expensive glasses, and the polished demeanor of someone who had long ago learned to separate his personal feelings from his professional obligations. "The defense is ready, Your Honor," Pemberton said, though his tone carried a subtle note of resignation that only the most attentive observers would have caught. Judge Monroe nodded. "Ms. Chen, you may present your opening statement." Sarah Chen walked toward the jury box, her heels creating a steady, purposeful rhythm against the floor. She turned to face them, her expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, on the evening of March 15th at approximately 11:30 p.m., Bradley Hutchinson III made a series of choices that would forever change the life of Carlos Ramirez, a hard-working father of 3 who was simply trying to get home after a double shift at the hospital where he works as a maintenance supervisor. Mr. Hutchinson After consuming substantial amounts of alcohol at an exclusive club, witnesses will testify he had at least 7 drinks over a 3-hour period, got behind the wheel of his Mercedes-AMG GT, a vehicle capable of speeds exceeding 190 miles per hour. He then proceeded to drive through a residential neighborhood at speeds we estimate, based on witness testimony and accident reconstruction, exceeded 90 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. She paused, letting the numbers sink in. In the gallery, you could hear people shifting in their seats, the leather creaking, breath being drawn in sharp through teeth. Carlos Ramirez was crossing the street at a marked crosswalk with the light in his favor when Mr. Hutchinson's vehicle struck him. The impact was so severe that Mr. Ramirez was thrown nearly 40 feet. He sustained multiple fractures, internal bleeding, a traumatic brain injury and spinal damage that will affect him for the rest of his life. His medical bills have already exceeded $800,000, and he will never work again. His youngest daughter, who is 8 years old, still has nightmares about the night the hospital called to say her father might not make it through surgery. Sarah Chen's voice remained steady, professional, but there was steel beneath the words. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what Mr. Hutchinson did next. He stopped his vehicle approximately 200 yards from the impact site. Witnesses saw him get out, look back toward where Mr. Ramirez lay, bleeding and unconscious in the street, and then, after making a phone call, he got back in his car and drove away. He left Carlos Ramirez to die on that cold pavement while he went home, parked his damaged vehicle in his garage, and went to sleep in his comfortable bed. A woman in the gallery gasped audibly. Judge Monroe's eyes flickered toward her briefly, then returned to the prosecutor. The evidence will show that Mr. Hutchinson used his family connections to attempt to obstruct the investigation that followed. Phone records will prove he called his father, Governor Hutchinson, within minutes of the accident. Within an hour, the responding officers received calls from the governor's office inquiring about the incident. Within 2 hours, the Mercedes was moved from Mr. Hutchinson's residence to an undisclosed location. It took investigators 3 days to locate the vehicle, and by then it had been partially cleaned, though forensic evidence still conclusively links it to the accident. Sarah Chen turned to look directly at Bradley, who was leaning back in his chair, examining his fingernails with studied boredom. This case is about accountability. It's about whether our justice system applies equally to everyone, or whether wealth and political power can still buy impunity for even the most egregious crimes. The evidence will show beyond any reasonable doubt that Bradley Hutchinson III is guilty of every charge brought against him, and that his actions afterward demonstrate not remorse, but contempt. Contempt for his victim, contempt for the law, and contempt for every person in this courtroom. She returned to her seat. The silence that followed was absolute. Judge Monroe looked toward the defense table. Mr. Pemberton, your opening statement. Gerald Pemberton rose slowly, adjusting his tie as he did so. He approached the jury with the careful steps of a man walking through a minefield. Ladies and gentlemen, my client is not on trial for who his father is. He's not on trial for being wealthy or privileged. He's on trial for specific charges, and the burden of proof lies with the prosecution. Yes, there was an accident. Yes, Mr. Ramirez was injured, and that is tragic. But accidents happen every day, and the question before you is not whether something terrible occurred, it's whether my client is criminally responsible in the manner the state alleges. He paused, gauging their reactions. Several jurors were already frowning. The prosecution will present their version of events, but I ask you to remember that a version is not the same as the truth. The evidence regarding my client's actions that night will show that the situation is far more complicated than the state would have you believe. We will demonstrate that, Your Honor! Bradley Hutchinson III's voice cut through his lawyer's statement like a knife through silk. He was standing now, ignoring Pemberton's restraining hand on his arm. Your Honor, may I address the court? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Pemberton's face went pale. Judge Monroe raised one hand, and the room fell silent instantly. "Mr. Hutchinson, you will sit down and allow your attorney to represent you, or I will hold you in contempt." Monroe's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Bradley smiled, actually smiled, an expression so infused with arrogance that several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I think we're all wasting our time here. My father is Governor Marcus Hutchinson. I'm sure you're aware of who he is and what that means. This whole proceeding is a political witch hunt, and frankly, I think we can all just acknowledge that and move on." The courtroom exploded. People were standing, shouting, the bailiffs moving forward. Pemberton had dropped his head into his hands. Sarah Chen was on her feet, her face flushed with fury. Judge Monroe's gavel came down once, a single sharp crack that cut through the chaos like a gunshot. Silence. The room froze. Monroe's eyes were locked on Bradley now, and there was something in that gaze that made even the most arrogant man in the room suddenly look uncertain. The judge stood slowly, his full height and bearing now on display. He looked like a monument to justice itself, carved from stone and principle. "Mr. Hutchinson, you will sit down now." Something in that voice, in those eyes, finally penetrated Bradley's armor of entitlement. He sat, but the smirk remained on his face, defiant, mocking. Judge Monroe remained standing. "Let me be abundantly clear about something, Mr. Hutchinson, and I want everyone in this courtroom to understand this as well. I don't care who your father is. I don't care about his office, his political connections, or his influence. Those things have no currency in this courtroom. The only thing that matters here is the law and the evidence. Your family name is not a shield. Your wealth is not a defense. And your apparent belief that you are somehow above accountability is not a legal strategy. It's evidence of the very character that brought you to this point." The silence in the courtroom was so complete, you could hear the old clock on the wall ticking, each second falling like a hammer blow. "You are charged with serious crimes, Mr. Hutchinson. A man nearly died because of someone's actions that night, and if the evidence proves it was your actions, you will face the full consequences under the law. Do I make myself clear?" Bradley started to respond, but Pemberton grabbed his arm hard enough to leave marks and hissed something in his ear. Bradley nodded stiffly. "Mr. Pemberton, control your client or I will remove him from this courtroom and proceed in absentia. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," Pemberton said, his voice tight with stress. Judge Monroe sat down, but his presence seemed even larger now, as if he had expanded to fill every corner of the room with his authority. "Ms. Chen, call your first witness." Over the next 2 hours, the prosecution built their case with methodical precision. The first witness was Officer Rachel Morrison, one of the first responders to the scene. She described finding Carlos Ramirez unconscious, bleeding from his head and ears, his legs twisted at unnatural angles. She described the debris field, the skid marks, the evidence of high-speed impact. Her voice remained professional throughout, but several jurors were visibly affected, one woman wiping her eyes. "Officer Morrison," Sarah Chen said, "can you describe what you found when you canvassed the area?" "Yes, ma'am. Approximately 200 yards from the impact site, we found fresh tire marks and fluid droplets consistent with a damaged vehicle that had stopped briefly. There were footprints in the dirt shoulder, expensive dress shoes, size 11, and we found this." She held up an evidence bag containing what appeared to be a piece of chrome trim with part of a Mercedes logo. This was found at the stop site. Forensic analysis later matched it to the defendant's vehicle. "Thank you, Officer Morrison." The next witness was Dr. James Patterson, the trauma surgeon who had operated on Carlos Ramirez. He was a thin man in his 50s, with tired eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Dr. Patterson," Sarah Chen began, "can you describe Mr. Ramirez's injuries when he arrived at the hospital?" The doctor took a deep breath. He was in critical condition. Multiple compound fractures to both legs, fractured pelvis, 6 broken ribs, one of which had punctured his lung. severe head trauma resulting in a subdural hematoma, and spinal contusions. His chances of survival were less than 50% when he arrived. We operated for 11 hours. And his prognosis now? He survived, but he will never fully recover. He has permanent mobility issues due to the spinal damage and bone malunion. He has chronic pain that will require lifelong management. He suffers from traumatic brain injury symptoms, including memory problems and mood disturbances. His life, as he knew it, is over. Bradley yawned, during this testimony. Several jurors saw it, and their expressions hardened. The prosecution's star witness was Maria Chen, a graduate student who had been walking her dog that night. She had been less than 50 feet away when the accident occurred. Ms. Chen, can you tell us what you saw that night? Maria was 24, with long dark hair and glasses. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. I was walking Buddy, my dog, on the sidewalk. It was quiet, late. I heard the car before I saw it. The engine was so loud, roaring like it was angry. Then I saw the headlights coming down the street, and the car was going so fast, it was like a blur. Mr. Ramirez had just stepped into the crosswalk. The light was green for him, I saw it. And the car didn't even slow down. It just hit him. She paused, swallowing hard. The sound, I'll never forget the sound. And then he was flying through the air, and he hit the ground and he wasn't moving. I was screaming, calling 911, running toward him. Other people came, and then I looked up and saw the car had stopped down the street. I saw someone get out, a man in a dark suit. He looked back toward us, and I remember thinking he was going to help, that he was coming back. But then he got on his phone, and after maybe 2 minutes, he got back in the car and drove away. Just drove away like Mr. Ramirez was nothing. Can you identify that man, Ms. Chen? Yes. She pointed at Bradley. It was him, I'm certain. The police showed me photos later and I picked him out immediately. It was definitely him. Throughout this testimony, Bradley sat with his arms crossed, his expression one of theatrical boredom. At one point, he leaned over to whisper something to Pemberton, and both the judge and several jurors saw him laugh quietly. Judge Monroe's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something cold and final. The prosecution's final witness of the day was Detective Marcus Williams, the lead investigator on the case. He was a large black man in his 40s, with a shaved head, and the bearing of someone who had seen humanity at its worst and somehow maintained his faith in justice. Detective Williams, Sarah Chen said, can you walk us through the investigation? Yes, ma'am. We identified Mr. Hutchinson as a suspect within hours based on the vehicle debris, witness descriptions, and security camera footage from businesses along his route that caught his license plate. We attempted to locate his vehicle for forensic examination, but we encountered obstacles. What kind of obstacles? Within an hour of the accident, I received a call from a deputy in the governor's office asking about the investigation. I was told to proceed carefully, given the sensitive nature of the parties involved. When we arrived at Mr. Hutchinson's residence with a warrant to examine his vehicle, it was gone. We later discovered it had been moved to a private garage owned by one of the governor's campaign donors. By the time we located and seized it 3 days later, it had been partially cleaned. But you still found evidence? Yes. Blood evidence matching the victim was found in the vehicle's undercarriage and wheel wells. Paint transfer and damage patterns matched the accident scene. And we found the defendant's cell phone records showing he called his father, Governor Hutchinson, at 11:47 p.m., approximately 12 minutes after the accident. That call lasted 4 minutes. Immediately afterward, the vehicle was moved. Sarah Chen nodded. Detective, in your professional opinion, was this a case of someone making a mistake and panicking or something else? Objection, Pemberton said wearily. Calls for speculation. Sustained, Judge Monroe said, but the question had already done its work with the jury. By the time the court recessed for the day, the prosecution had built a devastating case, but the real fireworks were yet to come. The next morning, the defense began their presentation. Pemberton had clearly spent the night trying to craft a strategy that didn't rely on his client's family connections, and he'd settled on attacking the reliability of witness testimony and suggesting the possibility that Bradley had been in shock and not thinking clearly. But Bradley Hutchinson III had other ideas. Against all legal advice, Bradley insisted on taking the stand. Pemberton argued with him for 20 minutes in the hallway, his voice carrying into the courtroom in frustrated whispers. But Bradley was adamant. He believed, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never faced real consequences, that his charm and family name would sway the jury. He was sworn in and took his seat in the witness box with the casual confidence of someone sitting down for a friendly interview. He smiled at the jury. Several of them didn't smile back. Pemberton approached with the expression of a man walking to his own execution. "Mr. Hutchinson, can you tell the jury in your own words what happened on the night of March 15th? "Sure," Bradley said, leaning back in the chair. "I was out with friends at the Alexandria Club. We had some drinks, yeah, but I wasn't drunk. I'm a big guy. I can handle my alcohol. When I left to drive home, I was fine. I was driving down Maple Street, and this guy just stepped out in front of my car. I didn't have time to stop. It happened so fast. 1 second the road was clear. The next second, boom! I didn't even see him until it was too late. And after the impact, I was in shock. I didn't know what to do. I drove a little way down the street and stopped to call my father because I was freaking out. He told me to come home, so I did." Sarah Chen was on her feet the moment Pemberton sat down. She approached Bradley like a predator circling wounded prey. "Mr. Hutchinson, you testified that you can handle your alcohol. How much did you have to drink that night?" "I don't know. A few drinks." "The bartender's testimony, which you heard yesterday, indicated you consumed 7 drinks in 3 hours. 7. Do you dispute that?" "I wasn't counting." "You also testified that the victim stepped out in front of your car." Ms. Maria Chen testified that Mr. Ramirez was in a marked crosswalk with the light in his favor. Was she lying? She was far away. She probably didn't see it clearly. She was 50 feet away with an unobstructed view, and she testified that your engine was roaring and you were traveling at extremely high speed. Were you speeding, Mr. Hutchinson? "I might have been going a little over the limit." Accident reconstruction experts determined you were traveling at over 90 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. Is that a little over? "Objection," Pemberton said weakly. "Argumentative." "Overruled," Judge Monroe said, his eyes fixed on Bradley. "Answer the question, Mr. Hutchinson." Bradley's confidence was beginning to crack. "I don't remember exactly how fast I was going." Sarah Chen moved closer. "You testified you were in shock after hitting Mr. Ramirez, but you were clear-headed enough to drive 200 yards away from the scene, weren't you?" "I guess." "And you were clear-headed enough to call your father, weren't you?" "Yes." "And you were clear-headed enough to follow your father's instructions to leave the scene and come home, weren't you?" "He told me to." "Did your father tell you to leave an injured man bleeding in the street? Did he tell you not to call 911 or render aid?" Bradley's face flushed. "You don't understand. My father has enemies. This whole thing could have been used against him politically. I had to protect him." The courtroom erupted. Sarah Chen stepped back, letting the words hang in the air. Judge Monroe's gavel came down. "Order," but the damage was done. Bradley had just admitted on the stand that protecting his father's political career was more important than saving a dying man's life. Sarah Chen pressed forward. "Mr. Hutchinson, did you have your vehicle moved and cleaned to destroy evidence?" "I want to invoke my Fifth Amendment rights on that question," Bradley said, suddenly looking at Pemberton. "You can't invoke the Fifth Amendment selectively while testifying, Mr. Hutchinson. You chose to take this stand. Answer the question." My father arranged for the car to be detailed. I didn't know it would interfere with anything." "You didn't think that cleaning the vehicle you used to hit someone might interfere with a police investigation?" Bradley's composure finally shattered. He sat forward, his face twisted with anger. Look, lady, you don't understand how things work. My father is the governor of this state. He controls budgets, appointments, policies. He has more power in his little finger than you'll ever have in your entire life. This whole trial is a joke. You think you're going to put me in prison? You think some no-name DA is going to take down the governor's son? You're delusional. The courtroom exploded again. Pemberton had his head in his hands. Sarah Chen just smiled coldly. Your Honor, I have no further questions. Judge Monroe looked at Bradley with an expression that could have frozen fire. Mr. Hutchinson, you may step down. Bradley returned to his seat, somehow still looking defiant, despite having just destroyed his own defense. The closing arguments were almost anticlimactic after Bradley's testimony. Sarah Chen methodically reviewed the evidence, but she barely needed to. Bradley had convicted himself. Pemberton's closing was brief and resigned. He asked the jury to consider all the evidence carefully, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood. On the charge of vehicular assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of leaving the scene of an accident, guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty. On the charge of driving under the influence, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Monroe allowed it for a moment before restoring order. The defendant will remain in custody pending sentencing, which is scheduled for 2 weeks from today. This court is adjourned, but as the bailiffs approached to take Bradley into custody, he stood up and pointed at Judge Monroe. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, old man. My father controls your badge. You're a state judge. He appoints judges like you. You're finished. Your career is over. He's going to destroy you. The courtroom went silent. Everyone turned to look at Judge Monroe. The judge stood slowly, his full presence filling the room once more. He looked at Bradley Hutchinson III with eyes that had seen everything and been moved by nothing except the truth. Mr. Hutchinson, he said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, let me tell you something about how things actually work. Your father doesn't control my badge. The people of this state do, through their constitution and their laws. Your father's power ends at the courtroom door, and so does yours. You came into this courtroom believing that your family name would protect you from the consequences of your actions. You believed that wealth and political connections could override justice, but you were wrong. He paused, and the silence was absolute. You left a man to die in the street because you thought protecting your father's political career was more important than a human life. You showed no remorse, no empathy, no recognition that Carlos Ramirez is a person who matters just as much as you do. You stood on that witness stand and demonstrated contempt not just for this court, but for every principle that makes a society worth living in. You proved beyond any doubt that you believe you are above the law. Judge Monroe leaned forward slightly. But here's what you failed to understand, Mr. Hutchinson. In this courtroom, everyone is equal. The homeless man and the governor's son stand on the same ground here. The law doesn't bow to power, it doesn't bend to privilege, and it certainly doesn't break for arrogance. Bradley's face had gone pale. The smirk was gone. When we reconvene for sentencing in 2 weeks, I will review the maximum penalties available under the law, and I will give serious consideration to imposing them. Because you need to learn something that your wealth and your family name have prevented you from learning your entire life. Actions have consequences, and no one is above accountability. He looked at the bailiffs. Remove the defendant. As Bradley was led away in handcuffs, suddenly looking very small and very young, Judge Monroe addressed the courtroom one final time. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks that justice is negotiable, that the law is for sale, or that power is a substitute for character. It isn't. It never was. And as long as I sit on this bench, it never will be. The courtroom erupted in applause as Judge Monroe exited through his chamber's door, his back straight, his principles intact, his integrity unshakable. 2 weeks later, Judge Monroe sentenced Bradley Hutchinson III to 15 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 7 years. Carlos Ramirez sat in the gallery in a wheelchair he would need for the rest of his life and wept when he heard the sentence. Not tears of joy, but tears of recognition that someone, finally, had seen him as a human being who mattered. Governor Hutchinson called a press conference afterward and declared the sentence a miscarriage of justice. He threatened to use his influence to have Judge Monroe removed from the bench. But Judge Elias Monroe didn't comment. He didn't need to. His ruling spoke for itself, and it said everything that needed to be said about the kind of justice he believed in. Blind to wealth, deaf to threats, and unmoved by power, because in the end, privilege is not a shield, arrogance is not a defense, and no family name, no matter how powerful, is worth more than a single human life. If this story of real justice moved you, if it reminded you that accountability still matters in this world, then show your support. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel for more stories about justice prevailing over privilege, and drop a comment below saying justice for all, or telling us where you're watching from. Let's build a community that believes in a legal system where everyone, regardless of their last name or their bank account, stands equal before the law. Because that's the kind of world worth fighting for.